Hello and welcome to a talk about the video games industry and the changing nature of what it means to be a video gamer. As the title says, this isn't your grandmother's gaming anymore. My name is Napp and I'm the CEO of Xmark Labs. We do a lot of work taking leading-edge technologies like virtual reality and applying them to everyday problems like training. I also have been a gamer for much of my life, and I ran a studio that was part of a larger video game company for a number of years. I'm very actively involved with the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers in several areas, but including trust and safety for online games. So let's just jump in. And if you take anything away from this talk, I'd like it to be an understanding that a lot has changed, and gaming almost certainly isn't what you think it is. Throughout my career, I've encountered three very pervasive statements. The first is that gamers are mostly white and male and probably live in a basement. The second is that gaming is antisocial and solitary. And the third is that violent games often lead to violent behavior. And we're going to poke and prod at all of those. But first, let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And really, we're going to focus on the ugly and the bad to begin with. When you look at the statistics for online and online gaming, they really are disheartening at best. 65% of 18 to 29-year-olds have been harassed. Within gaming specifically, 57% between 12 and 25 said they had been bullied. And among those that have been bullied, well over half say that they were targeted based on things like their race or ethnicity, their religion, their ability, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, and this is recent data. When you look at the world of massively multiplayer online games, or MMOGs, they have developed a very misogynistic and homophobic reputation, and partially for good reason. And this disproportionately affects women and members of the LGBTQ community, many of whom simply won't play these types of games. When you look at the industry itself, fewer than 28% of the people building the games identify as anything other than male. Sticking with the theme of the industry itself, a plurality of studios in a 2020 survey by the Game Developers Convention, which is a very well-established group and highly thought of, 28% of studios said that they had spent no time at all addressing a lack of diversity. I find that shocking in 2020 that such a high percentage blatantly say that they've given it no thought. So let's talk a little bit about some history and how things are changing. Where are we? How did we get here? And I would put it to you that the games industry has undergone massive change over the last 20 years, largely driven by growth. And we're going to look at a few different things. We're going to look at revenue and the number of players, and then a little bit of the demographics. And then just as a reminder, the kind of games that we're talking about. So back in the year 2000, gaming was less than an $8 billion business worldwide. There were about 100 million players, and it was overwhelmingly male, 62% at least male. And the kind of games we're talking about are console games, the PlayStation 1, that sort of thing, and PC games. Fast forward to 2010, and you'll see a considerable amount of growth, more than 3x. We're a $25 billion industry now, serving about 3 times as many people. And the demographics have shifted. We're now 54% male instead of 62%. And if you cast your mind back to 2010, this is when the iPhone had started to really gain traction. Android phones were coming out, tablets were coming out. It's also just after the Nintendo Wii had done such a spectacular job of making gaming something that was available to all. The idea of grandparents playing video games with their grandkids was no longer strange. Now let's look at this year. We are on track to be a $160 billion industry. So that's considerably more than a 3x increase in the past 10 years. We're now serving 2.6 billion players worldwide. And this year may be the first year that the demographics actually shift to be less than 50% male. And it's currently dominated by mass market mobile gaming. Now, this combination of growth and the type of gaming that is driving the growth drives an awful lot of change, and we're going to come back to that. But first of all, let's talk about some data that gives us some cause for hope. We've already talked about, and I think been able to dismiss, the idea that the majority of gamers are white males in basements. That clearly is no longer true. It may well have been true in the beginnings of the game industry's history, but it certainly isn't true now. Another thing that is simply not true is that all gaming is solitary and antisocial. An Anti-Defamation League survey from last year showed that 88% of adults who play online games have positive social experiences. And they're doing things like making new friends, finding communities, developing a sense of belonging, discovering new interests, in some cases even finding a partner, all of which from a mental health perspective are incredibly positive and very beneficial. And this is all happening through gaming. So I think quite clearly the idea that video games are solitary and antisocial is clearly a myth. But what about violence? Well, when you look at the stats, and this data is from the US, it's from the FBI, but I think it's broadly true of most developed nations, you will see a decline in violence from the 1990s, if you actually look at the statistics. Now, if we zoom in and focus on the part of history that we're concerned about here, the last 20 years, and then we overlay the growth in gaming, you can see that the graphs are simply not showing any direct correlation there. Now, it could be possible that despite the massive increase in gaming, it's not being reflected in the violent crime rates. For example, what if that vast increase in gaming is driven by non-violent games? So I think as we look at this data, it's important to ask, are the majority of games these days non-violent? Well, here are the top 10 titles from June of this year, so the most recent data that I could get my hands on. And when you look at this list, it's broken out by PC, by console, and by mobile device. And for those of you that aren't gamers, these red arrows indicate games that have some significant level of violence in them. And by this, I don't mean just sort of cartoon violence where you're hitting something over the head with a hammer. I mean actually, you have to target a player or a dangerous opponent and inflict some serious damage. So, sword fighting, fighting with guns, actual straightforward violence. And as you can see, in every category, at least half of the titles are definitely violent. And that is a pretty shocking revelation. So I think from that we can conclude two things. First of all, as a society, we absolutely like violent games. There is a very clear market for it, and it's a growing market. But second of all, when you look at the data, there just simply is no discernible broad correlation between violence in video games and the popularity of those games and violent action in the real world. So, as the last of our three now myths goes, it's also untrue. But I do want to introduce some food for thought, because when you look at online gaming, many of our communities in online games are actually bigger than our biggest cities. And I think we'd all agree that almost every city on the planet that I can think of has a whole slew of issues, socioeconomic issues, issues with racism, issues with violence, issues with harassment, crime, you name it, they all have these issues. And yet when you look at video games, the top 10 mobile games now service 5.5 billion players. Pokemon Go, a single game, has over 1 billion people signed up to play it. Minecraft is nearly 500 million players. And League of Legends, which is one of the world's biggest PC games, they have 8 million people showing up and playing against each other every day. 8 million people commuting to the same place online to play interactively against each other. That's a massive community, and we're surprised that there are problems. It's inevitable that there are going to be problems. But what is also interesting about gaming is because this is not real-world infrastructure, we're not talking about bricks and mortar here, we're talking about bits. And that means it's easier to manipulate and change the society. So the kind of social engineering that might be very impractical to test in the real world can actually be tested quite extensively online, and a number of the big game companies are investing significant amounts in doing exactly that, and figuring out ways that social engineering can be applied to solve the problems of large communities. And sooner or later, some of that research may well be useful in the real world. Now, I do want to go back to the revenue chart that we talked about before, because yes, not everything should be about money, but the simple fact is, when you're dealing with corporations, if their revenue is threatened or there is an opportunity to make dramatically more money, those are the two ways that you generally get companies to change their behavior. And there's an elephant in the room lurking behind all of this growth, and that is that 85% of the revenue in the video game industry now comes from what are called free-to-play games. And free-to-play literally means it is free to play the actual game. So how does the developer make money? Well, they serve ads and they sell in-game things that you can buy to help you play the game. But that means that they have to keep the player playing. If you stop playing the game, the developer has no ability to make any more money. And that represents a seismic shift. It's a cliche, but it truly is a massive disruptive change that is sweeping the industry. Let me illustrate why. If you go back to the year 2000, buying a video game probably looked like this. You went into a store, you bought a DVD, and it was very much a one and done process. You handed over your money. That money then worked its way back to the developer and the publisher of the video game. You took the game home. Whether you played it or not, whether you played it for 1 hour or 200, made no difference to the game developer in terms of the money they made. That was it. The second you left the store, their work was done. But with free-to-play, that's absolutely not the case. With free-to-play, as a developer, I need you to come back and keep playing the game. And what's more, I need you to enjoy it. And that means we've just entered into some sort of lifetime engagement where my job is to make sure that you're happy with our product. This is radically different to the idea of just taking your money and not caring. Right? Now I have a vested interest in how much you enjoy the game on an ongoing basis. And that leads to some pretty radical change. So what comes next? Well, you can't give a presentation these days without touching on how the pandemic and COVID-19 is impacting your part of the world. And it's very clear that COVID-19 is really lifting all of the statistics for gaming. It's driving more gaming, but importantly, it's also pulling in new gamers, people that have never gamed before. So you're seeing numbers and all-time highs up across the board on just about every metric you can think of. But going back to what we were talking about a moment ago, all of that growth is coming from more diverse gamers. These are people that have not gamed before. And therefore, since we've already sucked up pretty much all of the white males that were out there for gaming back at the beginning of gaming's adoption, it goes almost without saying that growth is coming from more diverse gamers, whether they are older or members of the LGBTQ community or ethnicities that traditionally have not had gaming as a big part of their lives. Diversity is increasing because of the growth. And now cast your minds back to the fact that 85% of revenue is coming from free-to-play. And that means I have to keep these players happy. And that also, therefore, leads to the fact that if I am not thinking about diversity and the changing nature of the people that are playing my games and the fact that they are becoming more diverse, I am going to miss out on revenue. It's that simple. For the gaming industry as a whole, addressing diversity and inclusion is going to become a business necessity. And it's going to transition that way very, very quickly. And I was trying to find an illustrious figure from the industry that would actually have a quote that succinctly said that, but I couldn't find one. So instead, I've just put a quote from me, but I encourage you to look at the data and draw your own conclusion, but I think it is really very obvious that change is coming, and diversity and inclusion in gaming is inescapable, because without it, gaming companies will fail. So whether they like it or not, they are going to adapt if they want to survive. And you already see elements of this at work in the industry. There are groups like Fair Play Alliance who are doing fantastic work on inclusion and diversity. The Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers is currently working on a standard for trust and safety in online gaming, and the stakeholders are being drawn from across the entire games industry. So it's time to wrap up. And I want to encourage you to see gaming as a tool that you can use, and a tool that may have a number of benefits and useful effects for you. Gaming really is here to stay. It's a massive industry. It's bigger than Hollywood by 3 or 4 times. It's pervasive. You really should consider embracing it. Second of all, gaming is a way for almost anyone to engage with technology, and it's largely a very non-threatening way. Almost any age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, whatever identity you have, there are games out there for you. And in the last 5 years, there's been a massive expansion in the number of independent game development companies that are building titles for things like personal wellness, personal assessment, meditation, and goals that are very far removed from the traditional idea of what makes a video game. And last but not least, I would encourage you to think about the fact that games live or die based on their ability to get users, the people playing them, to take certain actions, whether that is to complete a quest, to achieve a particular goal, to collect a series of objects. This kind of incentives, setting of incentives and getting the users to follow proactively and engage with those incentives is something the industry is really, really good at. And for me, it's a little disheartening to see that a lot of the time that knowledge has just been put to use to do things like drive you pressing Facebook's like button or Twitter signups and so on. But the industry's knowledge of incentive systems really could be transformative for a whole variety of different topics. And I would encourage you to think about ways that you can put it to broader use. So with that, I'd like to wrap up. I'd like to thank Dr. Inkster for inviting me to talk. I hope it's been useful. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer them. Thank you for your time.